Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I would like to congratulate you on your election and look forward to working with you as we learn how to participate in the processes of the Parliament. I feel very privileged to rise in this place today to make my inaugural speech. As today is the 11th of November, I should make comment on the contribution to Australia of our service personnel. There is no doubt the importance of our service personnel to securing our nation. It is true that the price of freedom is eternal vigilance, and the sacrifice of our service personnel is a mark to that vigilance. I recall the striking feeling of walking into the Commonwealth War Cemetery in Ambon Island in eastern Indonesia to view the thousands of graves of Australian and Allied service personnel, many of them just so very young. There is no doubting the sacrifice of these young people made and the loss to their families, but our freedom is the reward of their efforts. I begin my speech here today by recording my heartfelt thanks to the people of the Cannington district for supporting me to be their representative in the Parliament. I'm very proud to be the first member for Cannington. Cannington is a community of people who are working their own way in society. It is a community with many migrants as well as many Indigenous Australians. It has families who are contributing to our nation's future as well as many people living alone either before or after raising families. There is no greater honour in life than to be granted the privilege of parliamentary service, and I'm very grateful to the people of Cannington for placing their trust in me to represent them in this place and to fight for their rights and their benefits. My number one task is to provide the electors of Cannington with the representation they deserve, and I promise to do my best to work on their behalf in all that I do. I would like to thank a number of people who have assisted me on my path to Parliament. I'd like to start with my campaign team, particularly Scott Cowans, Pablo Campolos, Fiona Stall, Viviane Tresillo, John and Helen Bissett, David Ashton and the Rowe family, as well as all those that helped in hundreds of ways on so many occasions. I'd not be here today without your support and assistance, and I want to thank you all for your help. I also have to thank my kids, Rebecca, Zoe and Liam. They have put up with a lot, and I hope that they understand how much I love them and care for them so deeply. And I have to give special thanks to my most special friend, my wife Kate. We're of course a unique partnership, and I want to record how much I appreciate her love, encouragement and support. I also want to thank my extended family, particularly my sisters and brothers, Mary, Andy, Margaret, Stephen, Claire, Bert and Joe, and their respective partners, their children and their grandchildren. We're a big clan and we've spread out over the whole of Australia, but I know that every one of you are with me today in spirit, even if you've not been able to be physically present. On that score, I must single out my nephew Albert I. Colza, who followed in his uncle's footsteps by becoming president of ACT Young Labor and also flew all the way to Perth to hand out how to vote cards for me on election day. I'd also like to thank my wife Kate's family as well. Also like to acknowledge Keliwaga Sumuwiganda, the family I lived with in Bandung, Indonesia during my AFS exchange in 1981-82, and the friends I made amongst the exchange students as well as the students at SMR Dua Bandung. It was a powerful experience for a young bloke, and it still lives with me today. I'd also like to thank the people that I've worked with at the party office over the years, including former Secretaries Mark Cuomo and John Haldon, former Assistant Secretaries the Honourable Dr Sally Talbot, Ruth Webber, Lois Anderson and Simon Mead, who's now the Secretary, as well as the various staff I've worked with, particularly the Honourable Carolyn Burton, Sue McGivern, Fran Lane, Sam Rowe, Charlene Farmer, Graham Pearson, Fiona Henderson, Ron Sayo and all the others. I would not stand here today if it were not for the support of the Shop Distributive and Allied Employees Association, the union that represents workers in the retail industry. It's a rare privilege to work on their behalf over 9 years, and a very enjoyable and rewarding experience working to get them fairness. I have very fond memories of good wins in workers' compensation and unfair dismissal cases, ensuring that employers who had treated their employees unfairly gave proper restitution to their employees. I particularly like to thank Joe Bullock, Mark Bishop, Martin Pritchard, Bill McIntosh and Stuart McLean, who I worked so closely with during my extended time at the union, and all who remain friends to me now. I've also need to make a special thank you to Jim Marr, who invited me to work for the SDA and led me to Western Australia 20 years ago. On that score, I want to thank the unions of Western Australia, whose support for the ALP generally and for me in particular is so important. In particular, I'd like to specifically acknowledge the Transport Workers Union, the Australian Workers Union, the CFMEU, the National Union of Workers and the Food Preservers Union have always backed my activities in the party. And I'd also like to thank many Labor members of this Parliament and also of the Federal Parliament that I've been privileged to work with during the 11 years of working full-time for the Labor Party and during my 25 years of party membership. It is always difficult to thank some and not others, but I would particularly like to thank Jeff Gallop, Senator Glenn Sterle, Stephen Smith, Gary Gray and the member for Willagee, Alan Carpenter. Finally, on what seems like a shopping list of thank yous, I want to particularly thank my good friend Senator Stephen Conroy, his wife Paula Benson and their special daughter Elizabeth. Steve and I have been friends since 1974, even before we became pimple-faced teenagers, long before we believed it was possible to enter Parliament. That we're still mates after this time is an important part of my life. I thank him for more than 30 years of friendship, support and encouragement. I'm very proud to stand here as a member of the Labor Party, and there is no doubting the enormous privilege that is granted to anyone who receives the support of the Labor Party to enter Parliament. I despair sometimes when I hear a Labor MP complain that they didn't get this benefit or they missed out on that advance or other similar thing. We owe the party always more than it owes us, and we should not be despairing that we weren't granted some extra opportunity, but rather rejoice in the incredible privilege that we've received. It's not a surprise that I stand here representing Labor. It's the way I grew up. I remember in 1992 when the leader of the Federal Liberal Party, John Hewson, told Australians that you can tell the renters. They're the houses with the unmowed lawns. Well, I grew up in the house with the long grass, with a rough garden, with plants recovered from the tip and a couple of cars parked in the front yard. And I was one of the kids playing out in the street out front. It's not that my mother wasn't house proud, she was. It was that she was doing the best that she could. Renting a Govey house, what West Australians know as a Holmes West house, was my mum's only option. Using flower cuttings scavenged from the tip was the only way she could have a garden. I received a considerable floral education, being told which plants she wanted and which ones weren't worth taking home on our journeys to the tip. Every Labor MP is supposed to be able to tell some story of growing up poor, and I must say it's a cliche. I believe that I grew up with great privilege. I had the privilege to have a father who proudly served Australia in the Royal Australian Navy in World War II. I would have liked to have got to know him as he died when I was 2. But it did mean that I had the privilege to take turns wearing his medals on Anzac Day. I also had the privilege of being part of Legacy every second Friday night down at Legacy House and every Easter at the 4-day camp. It was always a great time. I had the privilege of growing up with 7 older brothers and sisters who all gave me their love and their support, except when they were picking on their littlest brother. And I had the privilege of being raised by a strong woman who did her best with her 8 kids on the war widow's pension and the low-paying jobs she could find. I had the privilege of good education at a Catholic school because my mum wanted us to hear about the God she prayed to while getting the education she'd missed out on. One of my great regrets today is that Carmel Johnston, my mum, didn't live to see me enter this place. I simply can't understand why anyone would criticise people who are just trying to make the best of what life has given them. Sometimes Labor loses its way, sometimes we don't do our best, but at heart, we on the Labor side are always in favour of those who are just trying to make the best of the hand that life has dealt to them. I intend to use my time in Parliament to represent all people who are prepared to have a go with the opportunities that life presents them, and to make sure that as a state we grant ordinary working people every opportunity that we can. That's what Labor is about. Politics is a noble cause, and we always need to consider how we can improve the circumstances of our constituents. We should be prepared to examine how politics is conducted as well. We are very blessed to have inherited the Westminster system of parliamentary democracy. Sometimes the process of government itself is attacked for many reasons, often for narrow sectional interests. Some people will say that democracy would be better if other people didn't vote. I always find it a strange argument to say that too many people participate in our elections. compulsory voting is the process through which we make it clear to every citizen that we want them to participate. It says that we value everyone's views and that we are a better democracy because everyone participates. My support for compulsory voting says that I want everyone to participate because I value everyone's views. Next, we should rejoice in the strength of the system of representative democracy that we use. No one here received the unanimous support of our communities, but we're all here with the majority support of our different constituencies. We're their representatives. There are other alternatives like citizens-initiated referenda. Supporters of CIR would have you believe that this system is about empowering the community to make laws, when we, the elected representatives of the community, fail to adequately perform our function. And there certainly are successful examples of citizen empowerment, the most often quoted being Switzerland. However, the Swiss style of government is very different from ours, and it is not about grafting CIR onto the Westminster system, it's about a whole structure of citizen engagement. I'm happy to have more engaged citizenship, but CIR is not part of that actual debate. The most well-known examples of CIR is the various states in the United States, but CIR in the US is actually an advertisement for our current Westminster system. It's the preserve of special interest groups that have the resources to organise the very expensive campaigns that are involved. The role of ordinary citizens is to be a bystander in the CIR process, not to gain empowerment from it. The actual involvement of ordinary citizens in CIR is no more than the involvement in the successful Westminster system. And it is not as if the laws that result are somehow superior or better than the laws created by a Westminster representative system. There is no better example of the problems of CIR than the Seattle monorail project. This was a worthy idea to extend public transport to more areas of the city of Seattle in Washington state. The project commenced in 1997 and only died at the beginning of this year. Although well-intentioned, the monorail proposal is a demonstration of the pitfalls of a simple yes-no CIR vote. The process included half a dozen votes, hundreds of thousands of dollars of campaign expenditure and millions of dollars of wasted taxpayers' funds developing a proposal which would never be financially viable. Despite all the pitfalls of the proposal, it won a very narrow vote in 2002 in a campaign funded by merchant bankers and construction companies. When the original supporters of the project came to realise that it could not proceed in the manner originally conceived, they could not change the project or to better meet the real-world situation because they could not amend the proposal except by further CIR, which were defeated. The reality is that representative democracy serves our community very well, and opponents of our system of decision-making need to make a case for how things will be better and not just how they'll be different. And that's the challenge I hope that I will be part of addressing in this Parliament. A genuine issue for democracy is how to expand the talent pool available to form cabinets. I'd suggest we have a system that would allow ministers to be selected from outside Parliament. It's very rare for anyone to go into politics and directly into cabinet. On the other hand, there are many capable people in our community who would be open to the idea of contributing to Western Australia as a minister, but cannot, or equally will not, make the 10 or 20-year commitment that ordinary processes of Westminster politics would require. I would imagine that most ministers would continue to be parliamentarians, but this proposal would allow an expanded gene pool to form our cabinets, and the state would benefit. Not everyone who is able to be elected to represent a single member constituency is ready to be a minister, and equally, everyone able to be a minister is not automatically ready to be elected to a single member constituency. Another suggestion to improve our democracy is to expand the scope and authority of committees. Committees in the US play a much more active role in the process of governing. Partly this is a response to the fact that government is not formed in US parliaments, but is also a different attitude to the conduct of politics. It's simply true to say that much of the affairs of any government occurs without the intervention of politicians. Committees with a wider brief to review the operations of this vast set of processes without ministers automatically entering defence modes would be a benefit to the community. For example, there is no regular parliamentary process to scrutinise the hundreds of millions of dollars of expenditure conducted by local government. This massive bureaucracy, which spends Western Australian taxpayers' money on the authority of this Parliament, does not receive anywhere near the level of accountability that it should. Also, committees could provide a forum for ordinary citizens to have a greater say on the agenda of government. In the lead up to each year's budget, committees could take direct submissions from citizens and special interest groups as to their expectations. After budgets, further hearings could be held to allow a proper review of the government's expenditure priorities. This would also allow the committee members to question the expectations and assumptions of the people making input to the committees. This would mean that not only would the committee members and the government have to explain themselves, but also the interest groups and other citizens. It would provide an opportunity for genuine discussion about the policy agenda of the state, rather than the facsimile debate that takes place through the 8-second media grab that occurs today. Committees could hear the view of academics and other experts, such as market economists. They could challenge assumptions of the bureaucratic advice to government. This is particularly important given the comments of a former Under-Treasurer that Treasury deliberately provides government with false assumptions. It would also grant a greater direct role for ordinary people in the process, and it would allow a greater involvement of the members of this Parliament in the process of policy development and government as well. The process of open committees reviewing every aspect of the community's expectations and responses to budgets would mean that sometimes MPs would disagree in public with their government, and it would be interesting to see if the media would have the maturity to deal with that greater autonomy for members of Parliament. Finally, I would like to turn to the issue of caucus voting. It's often said that because only the Labor Party has a specific rules undertaking to vote together, that somehow we are the only party that imposes voting discipline. That's simply not true. All parties that form government in this state impose party discipline. The Labor Party and the Liberal Party are not particularly different. If I might have an extension.
Extension granted.
Thank you. However, this party discipline, in my view, is coming to a point of change. I don't believe that party discipline will end, just it will morph into a new phase of its development. We've already seen an increasing range of conscience issues arise as medical technologies expand to make the very question of what is human life become even more relevant. We also see a wider range of issues being legislated on. Communities now expect much more action by parliaments than they did in the past. In the UK, members of Parliament are not expected to vote for every single piece of legislation that is brought forward by their party. Members are expected to vote in favour of legislation that is included in a party's manifesto, but other issues that arise during the term are matters for negotiation between the Cabinet and its own backbench. In the United States, party whips exist, but are effectively the party leadership's chief negotiators with their own members. Each and every vote has to be negotiated separately, and party affiliation is no more than a guide to the legislator's general direction in politics. It is only appropriate, however, that electors know what to expect from a particular government, so it is important members support their party's election commitments. If they didn't, citizens may vote for one outcome but actually get something completely different, which is of course the fundamental weakness in US politics, where nobody actually knows what they'll get after they vote. However, as society becomes more complex and the issues that confront the community more nuanced, my view is that there will be increasingly be a greater variation in voting patterns by all members of the community, and that will be reflected in the voting patterns of members of Parliament. This change will happen gradually. It's not a question of a revolution. The daylight saving vote in the last Parliament is an example of the thoughts I'm exploring. This was a free vote on an issue that did not relate to conscience. The biggest challenge with this development will not be the established parties, who will find many ways to increase their flexibility. The biggest challenge will probably not be for electors either, who will be able to be increasingly involved in the process of governing, particularly if combined with an expanded role for committees so that they had a much more direct say in the agenda of government. The biggest challenge, I would believe, will be for the media, who will suddenly have to analyse political discourse on the basis of the underlying values of the argument. They won't be able to resort to stereotypes. There will no longer be good guys and bad guys. It won't be right and wrong. There will simply be valid competing interests on issues that need to be properly considered and conclusions reached. What's more, The media will have a responsibility to present all views on issues in a fair and balanced manner so that citizens can decide issues for themselves. It'll be raw politics and the real art of the possible, and it'll be an increasingly interesting time to have the honour to sit in this chamber.